Hello and welcome to our podcast on whether or not we should split our infinitives or whether it even matters at all. As always, when we are talking about things that deal with style or rhetorical choices, we have to go back to that rhetorical triangle. And again, the point of the triangle is to conceptualize writing and give us a framework in order to talk about writing and writing choices. So in order for clear communication to be achieved, we want all points of the rhetorical triangle to be working together, working on the same level of formality, working on the same level of diction, which is word choice, tense, phrasing, cadence. We want all of these things to be appropriate for the message we are trying to send and to communicate. And if we can get them all aligned, then we have achieved clear communication. And the idea of whether or not we should be allowed to split our infinitives is one of these items that can raise a piece's level of formality or draw attention to a certain element if that's what you're after. So let's go ahead and see what we're talking about in terms of what infinitives actually are. So an infinitive is basically the grammatical form of the word to plus a verb. Now these infinitives can be used as various parts of speech, and they tend to float around a sentence and can be used in various ways. So for example, I like to walk to school. So the infinitive in this case is to walk. Another example, to be or not to be, that is the question. We have the infinitive there of to be. And then finally, Johnny thought that to go now would be rude. And we have the infinitive of to go. Oftentimes we try to encourage students to think back to their taking of a world language class, because oftentimes in those classes they speak more specifically about infinitives because they use those as the basis for verb conjugations. So in order to say, okay class, this is how we're going to say speak or to speak in Spanish, they would probably teach them the infinitive of hablar. We can then conjugate that as in hablo, hablas, habla. I speak, you speak, he speaks. But the base of the verb that we're going to start with is the infinitive, which is to plus the verb, so to speak, hablar, or comer, or escribir. So here's what we're talking about in this podcast. Oftentimes, infinitives get split by adverbs, meaning that an additional word or words or even phrases are added between the to plus the verb. So for example, I need to quickly go home instead of I need to go quickly home. Or I am not sure if I want to so loudly declare my intentions instead of I am not sure if I want to declare my intentions so loudly. So that's what splitting actually is, where you're taking the infinitive of to plus the verb, and rather than keeping them right next to each other, you're putting something in between. So what happens? The tradition, or the quote-unquote rule, it's not necessarily a rule, meaning you can split your infinitives, it's not going to kill anybody. That the tradition or the rule is that you don't split infinitives, that you try to keep to plus the verb next to each other so that you don't split your infinitive. So what often happens, since most people don't understand this or don't know it or don't write in it, is that most people tend to split infinitives all over the place. We do it especially when we're speaking, when we're writing informally. But when we're writing more formally, if we choose to adhere to the tradition and the rule and not split our infinitive, it may stand out a little bit more. It may draw some more focused attention from our reader because it is so unusual that we are actually following the tradition. And so, if we go back to our rhetorical triangle, if we split our infinitives, that tends to be pretty informal. But if we choose to not split them and do it somewhat correctly, it's going to draw attention to that section of our writing. It is going to seemingly elevate it, and it is going to potentially add some formality to our own writing. And if that's what we want, for whatever particular rhetorical reason, then we should make sure that we don't split our infinitives. We should keep to plus the verb together. We should not interrupt those with adverbs or any sort of phrases or anything like that. So on this next slide, let's go ahead and practice a little bit. Here are some examples where infinitives have been split. How can you rewrite these sentences to express the same meaning but not split the infinitive? So go ahead and pause the podcast now, read over the sentence, see if you can determine where they have been split, and then see if you can rewrite them properly. On the next slide, we will show you some potential revisions. And here are some properly unsplit infinitive revisions for you. See how those sound, see how those feel. They feel a little bit more formal. They do draw attention to the infinitive scenario and force you to rearrange some adverbs. And so it will sound different, perhaps a little bit more formal. And if that's what you're after, then not splitting your infinitives is a better way to go. So that's about it in terms of this podcast. Again, as a style point, as an element of the rhetorical triangle, if we are trying to draw attention to certain elements of our writing or speaking, our rhetoric, then we may want to follow the tradition of not splitting infinitives, keeping to plus the verb together, not interrupting that form with other things. Again, it's kind of a rule, it's kind of a tradition. If you do split them, your paper isn't going to explode, but it may not have the impact you may be after. That little dash of something new, something unusual that people aren't used to seeing. So if you're looking for that rhetorical edge or difference, perhaps go back to the tradition of not splitting infinitives. As always, if you have any questions on this, please bring them in the class. We'll get those answered for you. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.